Since I started putting out these videos about my new system, I'm getting variations of this same question. Isn't the timeline an archive? Why not call the timeline archive? Why do you need a timeline if you already have the notes list? Fair questions, but the timeline, in my case, is not only an archive. It is an archive, but this is only part of its job. The other part is acting as a shelf. So let's talk about that, and maybe go grab yourself a cup of coffee, because something tells me that this one is going to be a little longer. Let me start by answering people who asked me, why have a timeline notebook if the notes list is already a timeline? Again, fair question. Let me try to explain that. My system, this new system, has two parts. Notebooks only exist for things I'm working on. And please don't confuse that with projects, because it can be anything. It can be, for example, my knowledge base. I ended up leaving the knowledge base notebook as a notebook, and that's not a project. So I prefer to call them topics, okay? So they're not always projects. My documents notebook is not a project. It's a topic. It's a document. They are documents. So I have this notebooks. I'm left with this only notebooks that I am working, that I work with them. I use them for something, okay? Some of them are in the shortcuts area, space, whatever you want to call that place. Those are the ones that I use for backlogs and work in progress. These are terms from Agile and Kanban. So they are spaces where I have things. In this case, maybe you can call them projects, although I don't really like that word, but things that I'm working on right now or that I will be working soon. For example, the script for this video is inside the YouTube notebook that is in the shortcuts area, and that notebook has just a few notes because those are ideas and videos that I'm working on. Now, when I'm done with something that is inside one of the shortcuts notebooks, I have to move them to another notebook to make that list smaller, because all I want there are things that I'm working on or that I will be working on soon. So I have to move them to somewhere, and there is no way to move them to nowhere. I have to move them to a notebook. That's an Evernote thing. I cannot do anything about that. So that's why I have to have a notebook to move them to. I would prefer not to have that notebook, because the notes list is already a timeline, as I have my Evernote set to order the notes in chronological order, reverse chronological order by creation date. So the timeline and the notes list are almost the same thing. It's an Evernote thing. It's an Evernote behavior. So that's why I have to have the timeline. I believe that some of the demonstrations in the previous videos, like moving expired documents to the timeline, they are the ones that triggered this situation. Isn't the timeline just an archive? And by the way, if you haven't watched the other videos on this series, please go watch them before watching this one. Otherwise, you're going to be very confused about the names and everything I'm talking. You'll find the link here and also in the description below. Okay, maybe if I answer why I keep expired documents, which is a question I get a lot too, you understand why that's a timeline, a part of why that's a timeline, not only an archive. Okay, in the past, I would have a journaling notebook. I would keep there mostly pictures. I don't journal. I don't write. Sometimes I would write a sentence. it's mostly visual, okay? So I had this timeline and also documents. So expired documents would go there. The idea was to create a timeline of my life. And the goal of that timeline was, and it still is, in now the notebook that is titled Timeline, the goal is to help me remember things, giving context to some moments. For example, if I want to remember something, when something happened, and I know that that happened when I purchased my first car, and that was a long time ago, I don't even remember what year was that. Maybe if I go back and look for the contract, I will know when that happened, and I'll see other notes on that old journal notebook that will give me context and that will help me remember what I was trying to remember. So I think of Evernote as this big, giant timeline of my life, because all the notes in Evernote have the date, have the time, and Evernote is a journal. Evernote is a timeline, okay? I believe I know what you're thinking there. This is just an archive. You're just opening old shoe boxes and looking for documents to give you some context. That's half true, because if you don't have dates on those shoe boxes, if those boxes are not organized, it's going to be harder to find. And if I have that in a notes list that is chronologically ordered, all I have to do is scroll up and down to that point in time and find the information. So even the archived documents, notes, and everything that I have in Evernote are chronological. They are a timeline. The difference is that before, I would have notebooks for everything. I would have notebooks for cars, apartments, everything. So they were all in this information, these documents were all in different notebooks, and I would always have to go to the notes list to find all that, to create the chronology and go back in time and find that information there. Again, that works. And if you are a person that loves notebooks, it will work. Just go to the notes list. What I'm trying to do is simplify things, have things more, an easier way to organize information and to store that information in a way that I'll find it. And that's why I replace it. The notebooks, go back and watch the other videos, the notebooks with tags. And if you think about it, the tags will give us this freedom, because I don't have to first create multiple notebooks and then become overwhelmed by where should this document go? Should this be in my journal? Should this be in my car's notebook? Or if I, for example, had a notebook for each car. So having multiple notebooks is, I like the idea of having this space, this little box where I can find everything, but the tags can do that. And the best thing about tags is that it is a way to have notes in multiple notebooks. I cannot do that. I cannot have a note in more than one notebook, but I can have multiple tags in a note, meaning that depending on how I filter those notes, I'm creating these different notebooks, and a note can then be in different notebooks. They're just called tags. Another thing that I would like to share before we move to the shelf concept is that I change the creation date of my notes every time I'm adding a document with let's say I'm adding a document today that has a date from, I don't know, 5 months ago or a year ago, I would change the creation date of that note to match the document's creation date. And by the way, I did that to all my personal documents, to all my certificates, everything that was in my journal timeline had the correct date. Even old black and white pictures. Yes, I'm that old. I have black and white pictures from my childhood, very young, and I do have some from my parents. Back in the day, a picture would have the month and the year printed on the picture. It's not precise because it was when it was developed, but it's good enough. So I would just choose a random date and change the creation date of that note. So the journal was already a real journal, and everything from before had the correct date. Okay, let's talk about the shelf. Have you read the article explaining how Evernote helped me with the incident with my dog? You'll find it here and also in the description below. What happened that day was I needed to go back to old notes, notes related to his visits to the vet, and those notes are now in the timeline notebook. And I don't know about you, but that feels more like a shelf. I'm grabbing, let's say, a book from a shelf, checking some information and putting it back. Maybe I need an item from the shelf. I'm using that item and putting it back. When I think about an archive, what comes to mind is that huge warehouse, the Indiana Jones warehouse, with all those boxes, big boxes collecting dust every day. And that's not what my timeline is. The way Evernote works help us have these two different words in the same place. It can be an archive, and it can also be a shelf. Let's use another example. When I went back to the vet yesterday, before going back to the vet with him, for a checkup, I took some notes of what I wanted to ask the vet. And I created that note in the timeline. Because after the visit, that note would go to the timeline anyway. And I created that note one day before. So even if I added new notes to that timeline, the where I ordered the notes would keep that vet visit note, I call this notes vet appointment, near the top of the list. And even if I added many notes to that timeline, even then it would be close to the top. And if it wasn't, I could simply filter the notes by his name or veterinary, which is another tag I use, and that note would come up as the first note in the results. And because I have his routines note, which is a place where I have the list of all the visits and some tasks, go read the article if you haven't. That's also another place where I would find this note. But again, this note and the others are in the timeline, which is in this situation acting as a shelf. But there's another example if you're not convinced yet. Throughout the years, I had hundreds of clients and an even larger number of people who booked discovery calls with me and never became client. All these people, they have at least one note in my Evernote. I say one note, at least one note, because it used to be one note, and then I moved to this super complicated and elaborated system with multiple notes that I'm now simplifying. And by the way, if you are a Patreon or a YouTube member, go watch the companion video where I share how I'm trying to make all these notes fit into a single note. There's also a link in the description below. So I would also have all these notebooks. It would be clients WIP, then clients, let me just check here because I took notes, clients archive, then clients inquire. I had to check because I don't have that anymore. But no matter the number of notebooks, one thing I always do to this day, because of the huge number of people I interacted with along the years, is search for the person's email and name on Evernote. When a person reaches out inquiring about my consulting service, I check that person's name in Evernote. And if it's a returning client, people would usually say that on the email, but not always. I would also check. I still do that. I still check the address or the name of the person, look for the note, and read about that first contact in case that person was never a client, or read about the client problem at the time, and then I can reply with a magic email telling the person, okay, I remember you from last December, or something like that. And again, I still do that. And again, that feels to me much more like a shelf. That's not an archive, especially because if that person booked another discovery call, or if that client becomes a client again, I'll move that note from the timeline to the new client's notebook. To organize that, when I moved all those crazy notebooks, dismantled that and moved all the notes to the timeline, I added 2 different tags. One tag was clients, and the other tag was inquires. So when I moved them to the timeline, I can still know if that was a client or not. Of course, the note is different. The way I take notes is different. If it's a client, the note is much larger. And if it's just an inquiry, it's a smaller note. I would quickly know just looking at the note, but the tag is also there to help me. But look, in the end, it's just a name. Maybe that doesn't matter to you. If that's the case, even better. In my case, words have weight, a lot of weight, and sometimes I spend way too long trying to figure out what is the best word to name something. That was not the case for my dog. I love Coffee, and he was lovely from the very first day. He was also very black, still very black. So it was either coffee or caffeine. But caffeine is way cooler, isn't it? By the way, he's doing much better, and hopefully the stitches will be taken off tomorrow. Thanks for watching. See you soon. Oh, if you are a patron or a YouTube member, there's a special gift for you down below.